Now, Russia's ambassador to Turkey, Andrei Karlov, has been shot dead by a gunman in Ankara. A word of warning, though, you might find the following footage disturbing. The ambassador was attending the opening of an art exhibition. The assailant gained access to the gallery by showing his police ID. When the ambassador was giving his speech, the killer shot him in the back several times. The attackers we saw there shouted, "God is great," and in Arabic, and "Do not forget about Aleppo." After a 10-minute shootout with the authorities, he was then killed by police. Well, President Putin has expressed his condolences to the family of the murdered ambassador. He also commented on the possible motives behind this act of terror.
This matter is clearly a provocation, undermining the improvement and normalization of Russian-Turkish relations, as well as undermining the peace process in Syria promoted by Russia, Turkey, Iran and other countries interested in settling this conflict.
Well, let's get more information now from Ilya Petrenko. Ilya, how could this murder affect relations then between those countries, Russia, Turkey and Iran?
Well, of course, relationships between Russia and Turkey in the past year or so have experienced many ups and downs, and this particular incident of course, it is outstanding. Now, just about 20 minutes ago, the meeting between the foreign ministers of Russia and Turkey began here in Moscow, and everybody's waiting for something to come out of it. Of course, we understand that we've heard from people commenting on that all over the world that this is an outrageous act of terrorism, the death of the Russian ambassador in Ankara, something that cannot be tolerated. Well, the leaders of Russia and Turkey agreed that this could be a provocation to really hamper and derail the process of really rebuilding ties between Russia and Turkey. Here's what Sergei Lavrov and the president of Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan, said about that earlier.
We know that this is a provocation aimed specifically at damaging the normalizing of relations between Turkey and Russia. The Russian government and the Turkish government will not rise to the bait.
The main thing is to find out who is behind this attack. As President Putin said in his speech on TV and during the phone call with President Erdogan, we are convinced that the aim of this barbaric act is to undermine the process of relations normalization between Russia and Turkey for a more effective war on terrorism in Syria.
Buradan gelirse kim kaldıracak?
Well, of course, we understand that this terrible incident now puts the whole stability in the region in jeopardy because those kind of situations, we remember, if we look at the history, wars started after such terrible murders. But I can tell you that, judging by what was said in the opening remarks by the foreign ministers of Russia and Turkey at the meeting here in Moscow, they're ready to react to this swiftly and work together on investigating the murder. But of course, if we look at the recent chapters of relationships between Moscow and Ankara, it has been quite a bumpy road. Here's a little video for you to be reminded of what was happening in the relations between the two countries.
The last couple of years have been a turbulent time for Russia-Turkey relations. They initially nosedived when Turkey downed a Russian military jet in November. an act which prompted Russia to react harshly and impose sanctions on Turkey. However, there was a bigger threat in sight for Turkey. A new wave of Islamist terrorism was on the rise. Over the last 2 years, there has been a string of attacks perpetrated by both ISIL and enemies of the state that have killed hundreds of people. But despite tension between the countries, they aim to continue sharing intelligence information in order to combat terrorism. And when the coup attempt happened in Ankara this year, President Erdogan was warned by Russian intelligence services hours before tanks appeared on the streets of Istanbul and Ankara. In August, Putin and Erdogan held their first meeting since the downing of the Russian fighter jet. They promised to return economic relations between the two countries to pre-crisis levels. One sticking point still remained, though: the country's stance on the Syrian conflict. President Erdogan has long stated that Turkey would like to see Syria's Bashar al-Assad step down, something that was objected to by the Russian government. In September, the countries held talks on how to stabilize the situation in Syria. They discussed a possible ceasefire in Aleppo and a joint military operation. To some, the discussion signaled a clear shift in Turkey's foreign policy. Ankara agreed that Syria's territorial integrity should come first when tackling the conflict. Turkey then sided with Russia on its mission to evacuate both civilians and fighters from war-torn Aleppo. The operation saw thousands of people fleeing to safe zones away from the rebel-controlled eastern part of the city. On the 6th of December, the Turkish Prime Minister called for the Russian-Turkish anti-terror effort to be intensified. That fight, though, is far from over. Turkey continues to experience deadly terror attacks. And now, with the assassination of Russia's ambassador, it appears that terrorists are desperately trying to weaken ties between the two countries.